Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Andrew Potter. I'm a professor at the Max Bell School of Public Policy, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the first Max Bell event of the academic year for 2021-2022. Like the last school year, this is a virtual event. Hopefully we'll have some more in-person ones as we go through, but this one is a virtual event. But regardless, I'd like to start by noting something, which is that the Max Bell School of Public Policy and the McGill University, pardon me, are situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples. This includes the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. And so we acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which the peoples of the world now gather. Furthermore, the Max Bell School acknowledges the ways in which public policy has contributed to or failed to address systemic oppression. And we aim to develop in solidarity with Indigenous peoples research and a curriculum that emphasizes the importance of representation and equitable public policy. So again, thank you and welcome to this first Max Bell event of the year. I'm delighted that we're able to present this event. I don't like the circumstances under which it's happening, but the event is a panel discussion on the question Afghanistan in crisis, where and when did the West go wrong? And I think this is something that somewhat caught some of us off guard at any rate, because as the 20th anniversary of the attacks of 9/11 approach, we seem to have come, unfortunately, first full circle in Afghanistan, with the Taliban back in power, a group this time, ISIS this time, using the country as a basis from which to attack Westerners. Another American president is vowing to bring the terrorists to justice through any means necessary. So in this light, it's hard to see that the two-decade effort that the West undertook in Afghanistan as anything but a tragic failure. And if that's not the case, we should probably talk about it, because I think it's worth asking what, if anything, we accomplished in Afghanistan. What does all this mean for Western institutions such as NATO? But most importantly, perhaps, where does this all leave Afghans themselves, including and maybe especially Afghan women and children? So to discuss these questions, I'm really happy today to have with us three guests. First, we have Zahra Nader, who's an Afghan journalist and a PhD student at York University. We have Ben Rowswell, who's currently the president and research director of the Canadian International Council and the former head of the NATO Provincial Reconstruction Team in Kandahar. And Grant Kippen, who is the former chief electoral officer for the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. So welcome the three of you. And the way this is going to work is the three speakers will each make some opening remarks. And after they cycle through, we'll go back and they can either respond to one another or I can ask them a follow-up question. We'll see how that takes us for, we'll see how long, maybe 45 minutes or so. Then we'll open that up to questions from the audience. And after that, my colleague Jennifer Welsh will finish with some concluding observations and remarks. We have until 3 o'clock. We can go up to, again, we don't need to use all that time, but hopefully we'll have lots to chat about. I'll be the moderator of the proceedings. For questions from the audience or questions from anyone, the best way to proceed is for you to put those questions in the chat box in Zoom. And I'll triage them and frame them and feed them to the appropriate guests as necessary. Finally, you've probably noticed when you logged in, this meeting is being recorded. It will be posted on the Max Bell website. I hope that's acceptable to people. If it's not, then you're free to leave, but hopefully you'll stick around, because I think this is going to be a really exciting and important conversation. So I think I'll start with Zahra. We suggested with our title of this event today that part of the reflections on Afghanistan need to consider not just what went wrong, but when things went wrong. And when we consider the United States involvement in particular, how do you think its early engagement, as far back as the 1980s, if not before, needs to be factored into any lessons learned exercise here?
Thank you, Andrew, for asking that important question. I think we cannot understand today the crisis in Afghanistan today without understanding how the Islamists or fundamentalists came to power in Afghanistan. So that's very important that we look at that. When we look at Afghanistan history in the early 20th century, it was a modernist and secular king who was leading the national liberation movement against British colonialism in Afghanistan. However, at the end of that century, we are seeing Islamist fundamentalist group leading the war of liberation against the Soviet in Afghanistan. But it's important to look how that happened, how the US, how the Islamists came to power in Afghanistan and reached to that position to leading the war of resistance in Afghanistan. The way I see it, I believe that the rapid rise and success of Islamists in Afghanistan cannot be explained without the US, cannot be explained and cannot have been done without the US support for the Islamists in Afghanistan. So let me go to a little bit of details here to tell like how the US supported the Islamists in Afghanistan. So the policy of support for Islamists culminated after a coup led by the People Democratic Party of Afghanistan in April 1978. So this party was a pro-Soviet party in Afghanistan. A year after that coup, the Soviet invaded Afghanistan in support of the so-called revolutionary government in Afghanistan. And when that happened, so basically using the name of communism as the reason coming to Afghanistan, this delegitimized many of the secular progressive movements that were fighting against the Soviet in Afghanistan. So the only group that came to be more visible was the Islamists. And then this is when the US and its ally viewed the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan as an assault on their interests in the region. So they were thinking, okay, what should we do? Like, how should we deal with this? How should we respond to this? So that's when they were looking their options and they come up that, okay, we're gonna start supporting the Islamists. They will fight on our behalf a proxy war in Afghanistan against the Soviet. And then they did that. It's been said that this was CIA's biggest covert operation in the history of CIA that the Afghan Mujahideen has received. So the Islamists that were fighting, they were called Mujahideen, which if you remember, President Ronald Reagan called them freedom fighters. So the Mujahideen were this backward-looking reactionary Islamists who possess animosity toward anything progressive, especially women's rights. So they were intriguingly, they were one of the reasons. So I had my former boss, Rod Nordland, he wrote a book, and he was a reporter in Afghanistan in the 1980s. He was saying that when he was talking to Mujahideen commanders in Afghanistan, one of the reasons that they were fighting against the Soviet, they were saying, okay, the Soviet are like promoting women's rights. They were giving women's rights to divorces, and that's what we cannot accept that. But however, they could not say that we are going to fight against feminism because the West is not going to fund a resistance that's fighting against feminists. But communism was something that the Islamists were fighting, but saying, okay, we are fighting against communism, and the US was more open to support that resistance in Afghanistan. So when the government, the Soviet-backed government, collapsed in Afghanistan with the fighting of the Islamists, so the Islamists came to power. These forces that did not have any power a decade earlier now became the new leaders of Afghanistan. However, these new leaders did not know how to approach, how to rule a country, how to unify a country. So they started fighting with each other in the name of ethnicity, in the name of political power, whatever they were talking about. So they started fighting each other. And over 1 million Afghan people were killed in that war. And many more were forced to leave Afghanistan, forced to go to, become a refugee. I was later on, I was one of those children that went to be a refugee, but most of them went to Pakistan and Iran. So one of the places that Islamists recruited from, this refugee camps was in Pakistan. So one of the places that they went to train the Mujahideen, the Islamist fighter, was in the refugee camps in Pakistan. And there it was So one of the ways, let me give you an example of one of the ways that the US helped in nurturing, in supporting Islamists, beside giving them money, beside giving them weapons to fight. So they spent millions of dollars in producing and disseminating anti-Soviet, anti-democratic books for children in that refugee camps. So it is very interesting to look how these books that children were supposed to read in that schools was like what they were teaching them. So for example, they were saying A for Allah, J for jihad, G for gun, for example, and how they were using this into sentence for these small children were saying, okay, my uncle has a gun. He does jihad with his gun. So that's how we nurture, the US helped nurture a new generation of jihadists in Afghanistan. It's interesting that Taliban used the same books, most of the same camps, to recruit the next generation for their fights in Afghanistan. So I like to give one example about how the Mujahideen, which Ronald Reagan called them freedom fighters, treated Afghan women. So Faridullah Bijan, in his book Women, War and Islamic Radicalization, translated the first fatwa of Mujahideen government in Afghanistan. So this is what was their first fatwa that they issued. I'm going to read it for you. So it says, women are to cover themselves completely, are not to wear attractive and colorful clothing and decorative accessories, are not to wear tight and revealing clothing, do not wear perfume, jewelry must not make any noise, they are not to walk gracefully with the pride and in the middle of sidewalk, and are not to talk to strangers, are not to speak loudly or laugh in the public. So this is who the Mujahideen were. And who brought them to power? It was the US that helped them to come to power. And as they were implementing their anti-democratic, anti-women policies in Afghanistan, the US not very concerned about what's happening to the plight of Afghan women and what happened. So remember that Mujahideen did not come to power without the US support. So it was the US creating this for Afghan people.
Thanks, Zahra. That's really helpful. Ben, I want to turn it over to you. Whether you want to follow up on the story Zahra started with, or whether you want to sort of talk about how Canada sort of slotted into this dynamic that was obviously pre-existing before 9/11, and what we got into there. How did our own strategy evolve in light of this background, and also what had happened after 9/11? And did we learn appropriate lessons as we went along, and did we manage to internalize those? And you need to unmute.
There we go. I wanted to thank Zahra for providing that historical context. I think that's essential. And I think it's essential going forward that we look at Afghanistan not always through the lens of Canada's involvement or the involvement of the last 20 years. So Afghanistan is obviously an important country in its own right. It's a country that will continue to dominate international attention, and it's a country that's had a long and complex interaction with the rest of the world for many centuries. And so I do hope we can take this reflection on this last 20-year period, which was quite significant for us, particularly in Canada and as well as Afghanistan, and always had that broader historical context as Zahra's brought. What I'd like to do, in fact, would be just to offer some initial thoughts on looking back on that period of Canada's involvement in Afghanistan, to reflect, to offer some starting points for what went wrong, but also what went right. And let me start with the right first, because I think there's probably more to be said about the wrong, but I want to make sure that this is taking the context for a Canadian audience. Why did we spend so much blood and treasure? So many of our soldiers dying there, 158, a diplomat dying in the line of duty, and 7 aid workers and journalists who died as well. I mean, this was a really significant sacrifice by our country. So let me start with a few things that went right. First of all, Canada went in there as part of an international mission to deal with a threat to international peace and security. The original impetus for the involvement of Canada in Afghanistan was not framed around the well-being of the Afghan people. We certainly worked hard for the well-being of the Afghan people while we were there, but we didn't decide to establish a presence in Afghanistan in 1996, for example, when the Taliban arrived, or in 1989, when the civil war entered a horrific phase. We came in 2001 in response to the 9/11 attacks. So I think one thing that did go right is that for 20 years, while there was violence in Afghanistan, Afghanistan was not used as a platform for major international terrorist attacks. And that was the proximate cause for that intervention in 2001. Secondly, I think it's extremely important for Canadian foreign policy that we did intervene in Afghanistan and we refused to intervene in Iraq. We aren't talking about Iraq that much, but these were really twin international crises, which the United States was very involved in both, and Canada was very deliberately involved in one and not other. And that's because essential to Canadian foreign policy is the conviction that the use of international force in global affairs must have a legal mandate. And we did ensure that there was a legal mandate in 2001 for Afghanistan. There was not a mandate for Iraq. And the distinction is critical to Canadian foreign policy. We opposed the illegal war in Iraq, and we supported the legal intervention in Afghanistan. And we upheld that norm, that the use of force must always be subject to a Security Council mandate and therefore have standing in international law. Third thing that I think should be remarked on is the incredible collective effort of NATO. This was by far the most ambitious operation that NATO ever undertook. That institution is fundamentally important to Canada, and that evolution evolved and deepened and strengthened over the experience of thousands of us on the ground, making NATO a real thing in a theater where it was not designed to operate. And fourth, and I think the one that I think is most significant, is that the enjoyment of human rights by Afghans on balance was greater in the 20 years that NATO had a presence in there, and in the years that Canada was there, certainly greater than the previous regime under the Taliban. And I'm pretty confident that history will show that the enjoyment of human rights was better in the time when the international community was significantly engaged in Afghanistan than what will happen now. And I think that's one reason why we have a sort of lump in our throats thinking about what's happening to the Afghans. That this is going to be a very, very difficult time for women, in particular for the Hazaras, the Shia, for many different groups, given the not only terrible track record that the Taliban have on human rights, but their fundamental opposition to international norms of human rights. And so those are all things that I think we should keep in mind when we discuss the failures of the mission, that protecting human rights is not a failure. Now, in terms of what went wrong, I would like to offer a bit of a structure here, starting like what happened within Afghanistan, what happened within the region, what happened globally. At the level of Afghans and Afghanistan itself, the Afghan state clearly failed to gel. The enterprise, to call it state building, nation building, what have you, the enterprise was to ensure that Afghans were able to run their own affairs using a state that they themselves selected and over which they had some control, and it was accountable to the people of Afghanistan. In that sense, the Afghan state failed to really materialize as a freestanding institution. This has been a failure of Afghan nation building and of Afghan state building. It's not a failure that's limited to these last 20 years. It's a failure throughout Afghan history. This is one of the areas in the world where state formation has been unsuccessful for many, many years. And it continues to be unsuccessful. This continues to be a fragile state, a failed state. I would argue Afghanistan has always been famously decentralized. the principal power dynamics have actually been dominated by what we could call warlords, where the people that actually call the shots on the ground tend to control regional parts. They have fiefs essentially. And the dynamic throughout Afghan history has been these warlords either going to war against one another or making deals with one another, and either going to war against international actors or doing deals with international actors. And that dynamic, unfortunately, remains unchanged. There was an attempt to transform that by having all these regional forces loyal to one particular leader become co-opted into the structure of an institutionalized army and institutionalized police. That was essentially the state building effort in a nutshell. Could you take all these warlords and give them roles, make them governors of this and that province, and have them exercise power within a constitutional structure rather than fighting outside of it? And that failed, and that dynamic remains in place. We had a very up close and personal experience with that in Kandahar, in the time that Canada was there with Ahmed Wali Karzai, the now deceased brother of then President Hamid Karzai, who everyone knew called the shots when we were in Kandahar. There were governors that came and went. Ahmed Wali Karzai had a notional title related to the state, but essentially he was a classic warlord. And we never managed to, in all of our contributions to Kandahar in that time, we never really made a dent in the fundamental power dynamics of that province, led by someone who was operating completely outside of the established constitutional structure. Another dimension of the failure, I think, of state building is that the vast majority of the revenue for Afghanistan came from outside. So you didn't have that natural dynamic of taxpayers and the government who was spending those taxes, and the natural kind of cycle of reciprocity. The money was always mostly coming from the outside. And so that natural relationship never rose. And then, of course, there was very, very high levels of corruption, so that many Afghans failed to see over time that leaders operating within the constitutional structure, elected by them under the auspices of the international community, were actually out for them. And I think there's a lot to be reflected on how we approach issues of corruption. At the regional level, I think we do have to mention the role of Pakistan, which played a significant role in the original establishment of the Taliban, sheltered them throughout, and essentially operated at direct cross purposes with the international community, the rest of the international community throughout, and which now has established itself as the principal international force interfering in the affairs of Afghanistan. Let me then turn to the international level, though, and this is where I want to reflect on the title of this talk today. Where did the West go wrong? I would like to draw attention to the fact that we're identifying the international community with one particular geographic area, which is the West. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's a common way of conceptualizing the international system, and yet it's one that I think is highly problematic. And reflecting on that, I think, could shed light on why the international community failed in Afghanistan. This sort of easy association of the international community with a group of states in Western Europe and North America is something that I think we should be ditching as quickly as we possibly can. And I think it caused major problems in Afghanistan. The international community was in Afghanistan following resolutions of the United Nations Security Council, a global body. And in 2001, for those of you that will remember the aftermath of 9/11, there was widespread, massive global support across the entire world in every single region for there to be some kind of justice brought following the attacks of 9/11. Even Iran, for example, at that time, showed tremendous amounts of support for the United States. It was this historical anomaly, this one period in 2001, where even Iran was on board with the United States. But for reasons that we can go into, it was a Western institution that was given the task of implementing the global mandate of the UN Security Council to deal with this threat to international peace and security, and that was NATO. NATO, a country that was created to deal with the situation in Europe, and it is an organization of European states plus North American states, operated outside of its geographic area, and I think innovated and did some things well, but it was an outside institution that had no connection to Afghanistan and was by definition a group of outsiders. The norms that the international community was charged with helping the Afghans to achieve, norms of human rights and democracy, are global norms. They're norms that are captured in UN human rights conventions signed by the vast majority of countries in the entire world. They may have some historical roots in one particular region of the world, although even that I think could be contested. And the claim that Western countries have to be better democracies or to be better suited at protecting human rights, I think is also highly contestable. But the mere identification of basic human rights as somehow belonging to a region that Afghanistan does not belong to put the Afghans at this tremendous disadvantage, that the aspirations that women play a full role in society somehow gets labeled as an outsider or a foreign concept. There's all kinds of reasons for that, but once that labeling is successful, then any domestic insurgency has an inherent advantage in saying those values don't belong here and those people don't belong here. I think the fact that it was seen as a Western intervention in Afghanistan, as opposed to a global intervention, an intervention of the international community to uphold international norms which Afghans have the same aspirations to as anyone else, meant also that there was inevitably a short-term approach, because any other continent that's involved in that country is not going to be there for very long. If we called it an African intervention in Afghanistan or a Latin American intervention in Afghanistan, by definition, you know that it's going to end. Whereas Afghanistan is a full-fledged member of the international community. The international community will continue to have a great interest in what happens in Afghanistan. And the international norms don't change either. So the framing of it, I think, may have doomed us to failure. My hope going forward is that we recognize the central role that Afghanistan plays in the international community, and that to the extent that we outsiders to Afghanistan are committed and will remain committed and remain passionate about upholding the rights of Afghans, we'll do so not because we don't think that Afghans understand those values or share those values. We will do so because we recognize that they are human values, global values, that Afghans share with us, aspirations that they share with the rest of us. And we structure our support to them in a way that includes the Afghans and doesn't keep them in this us versus them dynamic of the West with a certain set of values and countries like Afghanistan with another set of values.
Okay, that's great, Ben. Thank you. I know Zahra wants to respond to some aspects of this, but I think that's a good place to ask Grant to jump in here. Because Grant, let's talk with the international community then. You played a long-term role there, helping build democratic governance in Afghanistan and other institutions. You can either respond sort of in light of what Ben has said, or I'd like your own take on it, right? How did the international community conceive of its role in Afghanistan? And do you think it had the right priorities, building democratic governance and free and fair elections and so on, or was that misguided itself?
Thanks very much, Andrew, and Jennifer, and to the Max Bell Center for hosting the panel this afternoon. And I really appreciate the kind invitation to participate along with Zahra and Ben. Both Zahra and Ben have raised some extremely interesting points, and I'm not going to go back and recover them. But I'd like to say that we're presented with a unique opportunity in some respects at this point in time, and that's to go back and to try to assess, evaluate what the international community has done. And I would say it's not just the international community. We need to look also at the role that Afghan stakeholders had in this process over the last 20 years, because I don't think this should be, and Ben made the point, I don't think this should be framed entirely on the international community. I think one of the things that that perhaps was missing or maybe wasn't prioritized enough was the sustainability of the efforts that the international community put into Afghanistan. As Ben said, a lot of blood and treasure, a lot of dollars. I mean, if to be perfectly blunt about it, I think the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, Zahra, tapped it at somewhere between $4 and $6 trillion over the last 20 years in terms of the total amount of money that had been spent both on a military as well as on the development side of things. So that's just an astronomical number, to be quite honest. And I think it's incumbent upon us as Canadians, but also the broader international community, to use this point as in terms of reflection, to go back and to really look at what were the lessons we need to learn about our interventions in Afghanistan, perhaps the wider region as well. Because I think Ben made a very good point in terms of some of the actors in the region and elsewhere, quite frankly, that contributed or not to where we are today. So I think it's, and I would go back and suggest, you know, if people haven't had the opportunity, Zahra published last month a piece reflecting on the last 20 years of certainly US military and development assistance in Afghanistan, and basically came up with 7 key lessons. And I think they're germane for thinking about you know, what went right, what went wrong. The first lesson was strategy. Did the strategy fit what the objective of the engagement was? The timelines, how did we approach the timelines that were given? I think it was H.R. McMaster in the US government that made the point that really what the US did was 21-year plans for the country, but never a 20-year plan. The other one is sustainability, and it's a point I referenced earlier. How sustainable were our efforts? Were we really working towards building sustainable institutions, not just processes, but also with the people there, Afghan partners in building out sustainable processes? And I can say from an electoral democratic development perspective that you know, really things came up short in that regard. Personnel, the insecurity that was dealt with around the country also played a major factor, as well as the context. And I think there are an infinite number of stories out there, experiences about the lack of understanding about cultural contexts, linguistic issues, that you know, and also things that we didn't think probably important early on, but even the length of time that individuals spent, whether it was military or whether it was, you know, on the development side, et cetera. People in and out, you know, in a fairly on a fairly regular basis. And then the last one would be monitoring and evaluation. How effective were we in actually monitoring and assessing the success or failure of the efforts that we put forward? And I think perhaps the military was better at that, but certainly on the development side, that we collectively could have done a better job in that respect. So I'm going to leave it at that, and then, you know, hope to participate in the question and answer period. But and I think I'll come maybe a little bit later, Andrew. I'll come back to that question in terms of on elections and the democratic development, because I think it's an extremely important one. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Grant. I'm going to come back to you on that because it's something I'm going to press you a bit on. Hopefully you'll you'll come clean. Zahra, so you did in your opening remarks. You did a good job of setting the table for sort of the backstory, in a sense, for everything that happened after 9/11. What about after 9/11? there's this phrase that comes up in things like the Afghanistan papers, where the U.S. military describes what they were doing as creating a self-licking ice cream cone, which is one of those military euphemisms or terms that they love for basically the military presence generating the insurgency itself. That they weren't there to fight insurgency; they're the cause of the insurgency. And I wonder whether we're not taking that lesson to heart enough. We in the international community talk about what we were trying to accomplish there, whether we were at a certain point the cause of the problem, and whether and what that entails for the mission there. Do you have any thoughts on that, or do you want to respond more directly to anything you've heard in the last from either Ben or from Grant?
Yeah, there's a few things that I want to point out. First, maybe we can start from the question of election, because Ben said that we have, like, Afghanistan had like elected government. As an Afghan who grew up in Afghanistan post-Taliban, I don't really agree with Ben in terms of having elected president, because as the way I see it is the Bonn conference happened, so the warlord, the ex-Mujahideen, some Western educated technocrat have the chance to go there to present themselves, and the United States and other Western countries, they put together, cabal together this elites who their hands was in bloods of Afghans. So if we have the choice, definitely we wouldn't go with them, with the leaders that they still call themselves leader. Afghan people would not go with them, because they have killed us, they have killed millions. They are responsible for millions of people, like the death of millions of people in Afghanistan. So if we had the rights, if we had the say to who would be our president, we would not go with that. But the way I see it is that the United States, when like in the Bonn conference, when they started, it was basically more about, okay, like how is the order, how is the current order? Who is like the dominant ethnicity? Who is the next one? And they started sharing the power based on ethnicity, based on like, okay, so we believe that Pashtuns are the dominant ethnicity. So that we have to have a Pashtun president, because that's how things were in Afghanistan. So that's how things should be now. And then in terms of, so they created this government for us, which I believe Afghan people would never go with them. But in terms of election, I don't know like how the things might have worked, but I certainly know that whatever the election we have done have always been fraudulent in Afghanistan. That's one point. And the example of the way I see it is that we didn't have any say to who should be our president, who should rule our country. It was arranged by the US and other Western countries and paid by them. So they were giving them the money, they were giving them the resources, and they were having their own people. And also the way we see it is one of the clear example of this was into election 2014, which all of us have known like what happened. We had two people claiming that, okay, we won the election. And then who should choose like which one is really the elected president was John Kerry, the United States Secretary of State. So what clearer than that, we don't have, like basically he came and decided who should be president and who should, even he created another, position for the second person. So now we had two kind of person in Afghanistan, like claiming to be, like a kind of power sharing, different kind of power sharing. So I don't believe we didn't have any elected government in Afghanistan. It was all like imposed on us. And this were unfortunately a very corrupt, the government that the people that came to the government, if you look each of their history background, when they came to that position, they might not have lots of money, but when they left, they have so much money, and you can just check this. There's one example of this I see in the media right now, that some of the media covering one Afghan official that is selling pizza. So that's the news for the world. Look, one Afghan minister who worked in Afghan government is actually selling pizza. It's a big news for the world because all of who work in the Afghan government is now millionaires, so they don't need to go work. So that's the news that we see that, oh, look, this is happening in Afghanistan. And then in the 20 years that we had this government in place in Afghanistan, what they do is they just take the money, they take the order from the US, from the other international community that they were serving. So there was a list, we had, the government has a checklist. Okay, this is how the money is gonna come. So tick mark, how many women should be in this position? Okay, give me 20 women in this position. Whenever you have the name of 20 women in this list, the money gonna come. We want this many, like that's how it was arranged. And what was for Afghan people in that? We are still living poverty. Afghan people is still living poverty. The ones that working at the, one of the reasons that I'm very, like I'm hearing Joe Biden always talking that, oh, like it's because of Afghans. They didn't fight for their country. They didn't fight for their government. I always ask, why do you expect them to fight for this government? This government did not give them anything, did not serve them. Like for the soldiers, they are coming from poor working class families. They are working for $200 a month to be able to feed their children. And then the government is like taking money, stealing money from their food, from their salary, from the weapon that they use to fight the Taliban. So the government is like stealing openly money from them. And then how should we expect these people to stand by this government, to defend this government that in 20 years did nothing to gain their support, to gain the legitimacy of Afghan people? So that's how I see it. And I don't think that this is, we had an elected government.
Thanks. Ben, do you want to respond to that? Still muted.
I'd also really be interested in hearing Grant's.
Yeah, I do. I'm going to come to Grant, but I thought, do you want to just turn it over to Grant? Should we put Grant on the spot?
Well, let me just say one thing and then kick it over to Grant. I do believe that there was a pacted transition in Bonn. I wasn't there at the time, but my understanding is there's certainly a lot of validity to what Zahra said, that there was certain factions that had easier access to compete in political in elections than others, and so there was a sort of strong hand of the international community in the first election in 2004. I wasn't there on the ground at the time. I was there by 2009 though, and while there were certainly imperfections in that election, I do find it a stretch to say that those weren't free and fair elections. I mean, to determine how free and fair they were, you would need to look at how candidates were either allowed or blocked from running. You'd have to look at how campaign finance was managed. You'd have to look at access to the media. And in each one of those, while there was some failings, my observation from the 2009 elections was that there was a degree of openness to candidates being presented. There was a degree of fairness to the way that money was spent and media access was given. I'm not aware of there being like a very, very popular candidate who wasn't allowed to run for election. So take, for example, Iran, very different country, but Iran's elections, there's a debate about how free and fair they are. One of the arguments that I think those of us on the democracy side of the argument say that they're not free and fair in Iran is that the supreme leader and the conservative clerics get to decide who gets presented. I'm not aware of any kind of similar control happening in the Afghan election of 2009 or subsequent to that, where there was popular support for someone else to take power. There was certainly dissatisfaction with the politicians that were elected, and I completely agree with corruption. There was a tremendous degree of corruption in Afghanistan, but that's different from saying the elections weren't free and fair. I could say, if I was an Afghan too, I'd be very, very disappointed in the performance of the governments that were there. But to say that they weren't actually elected, I'm worried that we're sort of lumping in these imperfect democratic governments with outright dictatorships in a broad brush that might not be as helpful for Canadian audiences to make those distinctions.
Zahra, I want Grant to say something, but do you want to say something first, Zahra, and then I'll ask Grant to step in?
Yeah, so my point would be, I'm not talking, the point that I made was more about the fraudulent process, which was being done at the voting stations, like we have different areas. So there wasn't a lot of people going to this area, seeing who really votes, like, is this people who vote for somebody, is that real, that person voting, or somebody else is sitting here filling the boxes? So my point is more about that. And I really didn't mean to say like it was not fair. Yeah, anybody who wanted to go run, they easily could run. But no, my point was more about the election being fraudulent. Yeah.
Grant, I think you could probably usefully contribute at this point.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I think I'm good in terms of sound. I mean, I'll talk about elections in a bit, but I think one of the things that's important that we go back to sort of the building blocks of how we got to elections and what elections look like. And I'm talking in that regard to the legal framework that sets out the process for elections. One, the Constitution, and two, the election law, the political party law, and the political financing law. The Constitution, and this goes back to a point that Ben made about Afghanistan being a very decentralized society. When the Constitution came in late 2003, early 2004, it put in place a very centralized system, that was managed by the president, basically, who appointed everybody from cabinet ministers down to dog catchers at a local level. And that gave that office enormous power of obviously appointment, and I think it gets into points that Zahra made around corruption and nepotism, etc. I think if I could point to one thing that I think we collectively in the international community really came up short on, and that was the attempt or the ability to inculcate a sense of responsibility within the political elite of the country, where they would put the needs of the people in front of their own personal interests. And I think part of that was not just the way that the Constitution and the state of the government was set up, but I also think it played out to the election law and the use of single non-transferable vote, the SNTV system, that put the individual in front as a candidate rather than being part of a political party. And I think if you look around and you see successful countries in terms of governance, et cetera, the political parties do play a very important role. You can argue about whether they're effective or not, et cetera, but I think the baseline is most countries do have a fairly robust political party system. And I think this is, over the last 20 years, something that has, just has not developed in the country. And I don't know whether it's a marker or not, but I remember that conversation happening in early 2004 when the international community, through the UN, many of the European countries sat down to discuss the electoral system and how that should be put forward in the upcoming election law. And there was a huge chasm between, I would say, the majority of the international community and the views that were held by the US, in particular the US ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad at the time, and President Karzai, who did not want to have political parties in parliament. He had a personal dislike for his own reasons, and preferred to deal on an individual basis, which SNT afforded that opportunity. Going ahead to elections, to me, the lack of political parties had a negative impact on the process, because there was no ability of candidates to come together and to be overseen, if you will, by political parties, by political leadership. And while some candidates were affiliated with certain parties, whether it's Jamiat or Hezbollah that, or whatever. It was really an individual basis, and we quickly saw that candidates, because of the nature of the SNTV systems and the large numbers of candidates that would run for positions, like in the Walesa Jirga, for example, the ballot for Kabul for a Walesa Jirga member in 2009 and again in 2018 was something like 16 pages long. So to try to identify the person, the candidate that would best represent you was nigh on an impossible task. And so in many respects, the system handicapped the development and the ability to build confidence in a process. And it did get down to, and I completely agree with Zahra, that money became a big factor. Those that had money and influence got out the vote, and and it wasn't just happening on the ballot, getting people to the polls. It impacted election officials. And just a very quick story. When I was the chairman of the Electoral Complaints Commission in 2005, we got a complaint from a candidate in Paktia who came forward and admitted that he had paid $2,000 to two election officials to fix the results so that he would gain a seat, be a successful member. And he was filing the complaint because these two individuals had hopped across the border to Pakistan along with the money that he had given them. And he wanted justice. He wanted that money returned because he had made a deal with them. And so we had to suggest to him, we realized that by filing this complaint, we're admitting that you've committed an electoral offense. And to him, he didn't care. It was all about the money. So that was unfortunately, these kinds of activities did happen. And eventually over time, elections almost became an instance of resembled more a Bush-Kishi match, where the only rule was that there were no rules and you could do whatever you wanted as long as you weren't caught. So, I take Ben's point about free and fair, and I think everybody tried to do their best, but I think it was a combination of factors that really, eroded the confidence that the people of Afghanistan, the voters of Afghanistan, had in the process, and through that, the representatives themselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Ben, you had your finger up. You wanted to say something?
To sort of tie this up, I think there's a sort of fundamental truth in what Zahra's raised and Grant has confirmed here, that the standards that Afghans were entitled to weren't met. And I would tie that back to my argument about the international community conceiving its engagement in Afghanistan as a Western venture. I know that a lot of people think, I don't think Zahra would agree with this, but I think a lot of other people have said we were wrong to try and bring democracy or human rights as if it was, ours to give, and some foreign concept that Afghans had never thought of, that, wow, I get to choose my own government. What a novel thought. If anything, I actually found when we were on the ground, financing these kinds of elections, doing development projects, reconstruction projects, governance projects, I actually felt that we were far less comfortable with the concepts of democracy and human rights. We were bending over backwards not to be seen to impose values that we ascribe to ourselves, but wouldn't credit Afghans with also having those aspirations. I think the most offensive concept I came across when I was working in Afghanistan was the concept of good enough governance, or sometimes even called Afghan good enough, which meant lower standards than we would insist on as citizens of our own countries. Afghan good enough meant we'd make sure the government had enough money to keep schools open and run hospitals and what have you, but accountability measures, well, listen, they're not Westerners, right? Like the fact that these people might have some say over how government finances are spent, let's not set the bar too high. Afghan good enough will be good enough for us. If it's good enough for them, because we, see them in sort of a subordinate or inferior category, what's good enough for them, it wouldn't ever fly in, Ottawa West or, Maryland or wherever else we came from. But we were constantly kind of acknowledging that the international community wasn't going to live up to it wasn't going to hold the same standards when it came to Afghans than others. And I think probably the same thing that happened with corruption, this kind of perhaps cultural assumption that corruption is somehow endemic in Afghan culture, and we have to just accept that that's the way things are, or the tribes, like, this is a tribal society, therefore, women are treated differently, what have you. There was this like constant like dismissing the aspirations of Afghans because somehow democracy and human rights are concepts that were foreign to them. And that's where I think we did a disservice to them.
So this is good, because I want to bring Zahra back in here, and I'm going to try and follow up, Ben, from your question with a version of the question that Dirk Druitt, who's an instructor here at Max Bell, has put in the chat, which is, some people have argued, the place I've seen it most forcefully argued is in the journalist Anand Gopal's book, No Good Men Amongst the Living, that the original sin, if you will, of the post 9/11 effort was the failure to include the Taliban in the Bonn process. That created the conditions for them to then retreat into across the border into Pakistan and everything that happened after that. Zahra, where do you stand on this? Should the UN have pushed harder or should Afghans have pushed harder for the Taliban to be included in that process, or is that some kind of wishful thinking about the West, that if only, or wishful thinking by people thinking, oh, that was the original mistake, the Taliban should have been brought in from the cold, while that they were always going to be insurgents? Like, where do you stand on that?
So I don't know, sorry, I forgot the name of the book, but it's been said that Karzai said to somebody that, the Taliban were ready to, to submit to the US in 2001. But the US rejected, saying, no, we are not here to accept their submission. They were saying, so for the die here is that was the Taliban say that we are ready to submit and we don't want anything except amenity for ourselves, for our, our people. But they were denied this right. And this is interesting because I'm thinking about this, that even when the US invaded Afghanistan and toppled the Taliban government, they toppled one group of Islamist fundamentalists in Afghanistan, brought another one, the ex-Mujahideen. So I don't really sort of like see this, like I feel that the US and its allies since in the past 2 decades really didn't seize the support for Islamists, because in Mujahideen and like they were also like parts of these groups, but they were continued to be part of this government. As I really appreciate Ben saying that, we have that tolerance of the corruption, and there was a lot. Not only the US and international community in Afghanistan not only tolerated the corruption of Afghan people, but so many things that I want to only give you one example that I have investigated myself. And so that might give you a picture of how things were working and why it went wrong in Afghanistan. So it was last year, I think it was August 2020, I was seeing a video of a woman crying in a crowd. She wanted to set herself in fire, and she wanted to kill herself. And she was saying that I was raped by my commander and I came to ask for justice. And the judge told me to go kill yourself. And I'm here to kill myself because I want to give this government a lesson that we should not be treated like this. It was very interesting for me. So I was always looking to see where is she, like why nobody's really picking up her story, but nobody's talking about her. So I find it myself sitting here in Toronto in my apartment. I find her number, I called her. And she told me her story, like we talked for 5 hours and she cried on the phone with me. And she says she was raped by her commander in Kejran district of Daikondi province, that's in central Afghanistan. She was the first woman from her district to be a policewoman, and she was illiterate. She was a divorced woman, so she didn't have any other job opportunity. I asked her, like, why did you join the police? And she said, because there was no other job for me. I needed to survive. I needed a job. So this was the only job I could get. So I entered this job. And then one official visiting from Daikondi came to visit the police station in Kejran. And that police official asked the police chief of Kejran district to find me a woman that sleep with me. So the police chief asked this policewoman to go and sleep with this official. When she refused to sleep with him, that night, this police chief sent his bodyguards to go kidnap her from her home. And they did so, and there was a fighting between two factions, one of the police and the other one was NTS, National Security of Afghanistan, their directorate in Kejran. So they fight with each other, one person was injured, so they took them to the hospital, but at the end of the night at 1 a.m. in the morning, the police chief came for this woman, take her to the police station, rape her in the police station, and told all the officials in the district that nobody's allowed to register her complaint, nobody's allowed to write the complaint later for her because she's illiterate, she cannot write. So, and he ordered all the driver to not drive her out of the district. So what should she do? She find a motorbike. She went to the Daikondi, to the provincial capital. In the provincial capital, she registered her complaint to 6 different government officials as well as the Afghanistan Human Rights Commission. And what happened next is very, very interesting. The police chief of Daikondi, the deputy police chief of Daikondi, which is the second in command after the police chief, he came to her and told her, look, this police chief is very powerful. We cannot go and arrest her like this. You know, we need to play a game with him. We need to pretend that you withdrawn your complaint against him. And then when he came here, we will ask him to come here for some work or anything. So when he came here, then we will arrest him. So she said, are you sure this is how it's going to work out? He said, yeah, you believe me. I'm your commander. I'm working with you. I'm with you. So I will never betray you. And this woman, weeks later, when wife of that official, visiting official that went to district, and the police chief who raped her, the uncle of the police chief, which both were provincial council member. These two persons came to her hotel in Daikondi, give her a sum of money and said, you know, like, we know you have been through a lot, so take this money and go home. It was then that she understood she was deceived by the deputy police chief. So, and the government, so I talked to different levels. So she go back and she re-registered her complaint. This time they investigate, the case go to court, but at the end of the day, the person who raped her was never questioned. And when I asked them why he was never questioned, because he was the guy who raped her, you know, like, why? And they said, you know, because we talked to the bodyguards and we talked to everyone, they told us that he was not in the station that night. And so this woman, she was saying, I told them, go check when they log in, when they come and go, they log in a notebook. I told them, go check that notebook and see for yourself that he was there. And they never checked that. So anything that could prove that this woman was right was erased. And I talked to a few police who were working in the police station. They were telling me that, you know, like, the people come and take evidence from her case to, you know, to make sure that she cannot prove her case. And at the end of the day, she could not prove it because the court say, you know, sorry, the guys, even the court, how did they take the decision? It was that she was not even in the court when the court announced this decision. She learned later that all the accusers were cleared off their crimes and they went back to their work. The police officer was never charged, was never questioned, and he still remained on that work. So when I wrote this story, so it didn't really make a big sound, but later on when BBC picked it, BBC talked to this woman, interviewed her, She didn't want to be, she go on with her face, with her name, because she wanted this story to the world know what's happened to her, She didn't want that to happen to other policewomen. And this issue was a big issue starting from 2012. We were getting news that all policewomen are going through a lot. So she wanted to end this problem. And when she interviewed both the embassy of the US in Afghanistan and the EU embassy in Afghanistan, they issued a statement saying, this should be investigated. This woman should be protected. And that was all they did. So what the Afghan government did, take that woman from Kejran district, bring her back to Kabul, keep her in a room for 1 month so she can't go talk to any media. And after a month, she's back, she's sent back to her job, to the same district to work under the same commander who raped her. That's the story, how it unfolded. And then when you ask this question from the international community, that why there wasn't a lot of, this was happening, so why you didn't do anything? And they would say, oh, this is cultural sensitivity, we can't really say sometimes that, it is not good. That's very, I would say, very problematic for me, because our culture is not the way that the Western community in Afghanistan thought our culture were, we do not tolerate rape. That's not part of our culture. The way that this woman was treated was not part of our culture. But the international community, knowing this, they didn't do anything. And it's interesting to see that they didn't do anything after that, issuing that statement. They never asked for her. They never asked the Afghan government what they did to that woman. And what happened is that 2-3 weeks ago, I called that woman again, and she told me that she received a letter from the Taliban and she would be killed. Otherwise, even if the Taliban do not kill her, the commander would kill her. So, but fortunately, me and one of our friends from Guardian, we help her to get out. And that's it. Nothing happened. She never get justice. And that's what I see, that's the tolerance of this going through, and nobody is really pressing anybody of saying why this is happening.
Okay. Thanks, Zahra. I think I don't have a follow-up question to that. I think we're coming. We've got about 20 minutes to go. I'd like to get some final remarks from the three panelists, and then Jennifer, have some time for Jennifer to speak. So Ben, I'm gonna toss one question to you, which is, you remarked at the very beginning, your opening remarks, about some successes that you saw and some good work that was done. You mentioned NATO, but Grant mentioned that Zahra's pointed out that NATO didn't fight for 20 years. It fought 20 different wars over a year. And then if you divide that up into the 34 provinces of Afghanistan, did NATO fight, 34 different wars 20 different times without learning anything, or was anything sort of learned along the way? The bigger question is, was NATO the right instrument for any of this? Or was it maybe a mistake to involve NATO in the first place?
So I describe it as a success in the sense that in 2001, there was a major international problem that many countries came together, developed a common approach, sought legal sanction, received legal sanction, and collaborated in the delivery of that. Everyone knew that Afghanistan was going to be a very difficult situation, that bringing stability to this state that had never been stable for its entire history would be difficult. But I do think it's worth noting in 2021, when the idea of so many countries coming together and having a common approach and making such significant mutual sacrifices to accomplish any goal has become that much more different. In 2001, the fact that we were able to do that was significant. I think NATO was chosen because it's sort of the least bad option, or it was the only sort of instrument that was out there at the time. I can't think of another instrument that could have been used for coordination apart from the UN itself, which I think had significant problems. But going forward, we should make sure that NATO is not our only instrument. I mean, it's designed to do a job in Europe and North America. But the international community clearly needs to be able to mount peace operations in anywhere in the world, and the attempt was certainly there to build that up within the United Nations. If Afghanistan had happened, if 9/11 had happened in the late 80s or early 90s, it would have been a UN-led and UN-mandated operation. Perhaps that's what we should be getting back to. I do think, to respond to Dirk's question about involving the Taliban in the bond process, I think in retrospect, yes, that is pretty clear that that should have happened. There does seem to be a major correlation in history between transitional situations in which the defeated party or defeated power was excluded, eventually leading to an insurgency, whether that's the Ba'ath in Iraq in 2003, or the opposite, the way that the Nazis, individual Nazis, were quite prominent in the reconstruction of Germany afterwards. And there also was very clearly not a German insurgency against the reconstruction effort there. So I think that's pretty well established. And if I might, just while I have the floor here, to also respond to the question I'm seeing here in a comment from Shahid about a tailored democracy for Afghanistan. I think the argument here is there some sort of Afghan form of democracy that might be more appropriate than a form that maybe perhaps others were working on. I think the key questions to respond to Shahid are tailored by who and for who. I think every country's democracy needs to be tailored to the situation of that country. That's certainly what we demand in Canada. It's certainly what the Dutch demand in the Netherlands, and what Mozambicans demand in Mozambique. Yes, we should each have a democracy that allows us as citizens of that country to enjoy our rights. I certainly would be very uncomfortable with saying that Afghans have like a different aspiration to how they get to control their own affairs, and therefore we're going to design a different kind of like Afghan democracy for them. I think ultimately it's a process where you allow the individuals of Afghanistan to exercise their own maximum capacity to design their own system. But I'd argue also that that is what the international community was trying to do in Afghanistan in those 20 years, and that we could have done a better job if we actually took democracy seriously.
Grant, do you want to take a couple of minutes and follow up on that? Do you have any sort of last reflections for us here? Not your own final reflections on any of this, I think, but here comment on either Shahid's question about what kind of democracy might be promotable in Afghanistan and by whom, or is this something we just should have stayed out of?
I think there had to be a starting point somewhere in this discussion and conversation. There have been many that early on, post-Bonn and in the lead up to the first election, that perhaps this whole process had been, had been fast-tracked too much, and that the essential building blocks to building a more sustainable democracy just weren't in place at that particular point in time. Points to the Constitution and the centralized nature of the state. The comments I made previously in terms of SNTV that inhibited the development of political parties. I think there really wasn't the forum, if you will, or presented itself under the construct that was in place in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, really to kind of push that forward. My own personal opinion on that. I think there were a lot of Afghans that were keen to develop a more robust democracy, a more responsive democracy, something that reflected their views, ideals, aspirations, etc. But the mechanisms for that engagement just weren't in place. Again, I go back, and I know I'm beating a drum on this, but I think the fact that you didn't have political parties there really didn't provide the forum for that meaningful dialogue to take place. Civil society stepped up, media stepped up, and they're very important, but you really need an institutional framework to allow that to happen. Instead, what you got were, as Zahra had mentioned, the warlords that purported to represent groups of people based on ethnicity or geographic location, but they really didn't speak to the broader polity of the country, and they weren't inclusive in the way that they positioned themselves or their particular policies. And I think to me, it always got down to a case of individuals that were speaking purportedly on behalf of groups, but really at the end of the day, they were only looking after themselves and a very select group of people around them. And I go back to a phrase that was made famous by Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House in the States, that all politics is local. And I think this is something that just never happened in Afghanistan, that for all of the activity and the aspirations, and that we collectively forgot about people out in the, I don't want to say ordinary, but we forgot about the Afghan people and what they wanted. And it's, to me, it was never, this thriving democracy, et cetera, et cetera. They had the same aspirations that voters around the world have. They wanted better education for their children. They wanted a sense of security, that they weren't going to be, attacked or whatever, pressured by local commanders and warlords. They wanted some basic access to healthcare, social services, and they wanted economic livelihood. They wanted to know that they would have the ability to earn an income and support their family. And again, hindsight's 2020, but I think we collectively took our eye off that ball. And I think in many respects presented the opportunity for the Taliban to come back in, because they did address some of this, and particularly on the security side. Thanks.
Thanks, Grant. Jennifer Welsh has some final remarks she wants to make, but Zahra, I want to throw one last question to you that came from a question someone in the audience, which is, what do you think, how can the international media do a better job of covering what's happening in Afghanistan right now? Are there any ideas or issues being overlooked that you think need to be done? I mean, we were joking sort of before this started about, when this is going to fall off the front pages of the paper. It's not really a funny joke, but what do you think is sort of being missed here?
Thank you for posing that question. I think it's the main point is that the span of attention is very short, so we don't have much time. And one of the things that right now I'm working on is to make sure as much story we can tell in this span time that we have right now. The way that the international media approach is right now, we Afghan journalists can't really work in Afghanistan, especially women. Like, so many women have been ordered by the Taliban to not work in the media. But international community, they have that privilege of going there, and the Taliban would definitely respect them, would definitely treat them much better, because there's a lots of privilege, and also the Taliban do not want to really upset international community in that way that they do to us, to Afghans. So that's we would like to have more international media in Afghanistan that cover different story, but cover it from different side, cover it from make sure what the Afghan people are saying is not censored, because we know when I'm looking at the different sites right now, for example, I know lots of international journalists in Afghanistan. So one of them posted a picture, said, oh, the country is very safe now. I can work better than I used to work in the previous government. Yes, that's true for now, for you, that you're privileged, but please know that this is not the case for us, for Afghans. The Taliban do not treat us the way that it treats you. Please make sure that the story has the different side, has the voice of women, have the voice of different people, Hazaras, different minorities in Afghanistan that we have, which were now going to be much marginalized, much under attack right now. So we want them to, please, if you have a space, please make sure that this voice are raised, that this voice are given a chance to talk, to say what's happening to them, what's going on in their community. And that's very important, to don't make an assumption based on what Taliban are saying. The Taliban right now have said that they would respect women's rights, based on Sharia law, they would respect freedom of media and all this, which they stated 25 years ago.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
please don't believe them.
Okay, thank you. I think this has been great. I want to thank the three of you. We're going to close with some sort of wrap-up remarks from my colleague Jennifer Welsh, who's the research chair in global governance and security at McGill. She's also the director of the Center for International Peace and Security Studies through Max Bell. So Jennifer, you have any final thoughts?
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks hugely to the three panelists. I found these reflections, thankfully with enough time, we enabled you to, extrapolate on some of the important lessons you wanted us to take. I've been thinking a lot about how we move on from big events like this and how we frame them over time. We come to have a sentence or two that encapsulates a 20 or 30-year history and the lesson that they represent. And, I think, for example, about the Rwandan genocide, the lesson became it was a failure to intervene. How did that lesson get to be articulated for such a complex event as the genocide? And I see four different narratives swimming around that people might take to be the shorthands for Afghanistan right now. And I want to say a little bit about each of those four as we conclude. The first narrative is that, this is a tragic failure. The 20-year effort of NATO and the United States. And certainly I think we have to unpack that much more. We have to unpack, as Ben said, where certain things were successful or were successful for a time. But we also have to question this comment that part of the failure was, as Zahra said, that Afghans would not fight for their country. 66,000 Afghan armed forces were killed. That is a significant sacrifice, not to mention close to 50,000 Afghan civilians. So to capture this as they would not fight for their country seems to be an incredible soundbite to land on. But also, what's the nature of the failure if we want to focus in on the United States for a moment? And I think we're very much focused on at the moment on the failure of this once great superpower to exit in a way that involved very little consultation with its allies or with those who were most directly involved in the 20 years of sacrifice, but also that it seemed to have encapsulated the challenge in Afghanistan as one of, we're either in full control or we've completely withdrawn. And that's, I think, where a lot of the focus on the United States has been. But I think that, the failure is part of a long history. And I actually, surprisingly for some who know some of my leanings, I was reading Henry Kissinger before this. And, Henry Kissinger said something very interesting about the US failure. He said, when the US engages its military abroad and puts its reputation on the line, it has always had to start by articulating its strategic and political objectives. And what has proven so problematic for the United States is that it has been unable to, whether we think of Vietnam or whether we think of Iraq, to define attainable goals and link them in a way that can be sustained by the US political process. And so that failure of the United States in Afghanistan, if we want to call it a failure, is both a failure of strategy, but also of objectives and of understanding its own constraints domestically and how they affect what it does globally. So I think the failure narrative, I hope we will always press at very hard. The second narrative that I hear a lot, especially coming out of the mouths of the US president, is that the US should not get involved in other people's civil wars. But as Zahra suggested to us, the very act of intervening at various stages in different ways over the years changed the dynamics in Afghanistan. This was not a case of either outsiders are in or they're out. It's been a country which has been heavily penetrated, and we haven't talked about Afghanistan's other neighbors and how the US failed in the very task of creative diplomacy over the years to think about its other neighbors, particularly Iran and Russia. I'm thinking of here, of course, Pakistan, but also those two. The third narrative I'm hearing a lot is we're back to where we started. We've come full circle. But is that really true? The Taliban, we absolutely need to judge by its actions, not its words. But it would be pretty surprising if it is the same organization as it was 20 years ago. It is different in many ways, including the links that it's forged with different outside actors. The Afghan population is different and what its expectations are. And of course, and I'm sorry if I'm harping on this, the US is completely different. It's in a completely different place. I mean that in terms of its international standing. We may say it's very similar in terms of how it works domestically, but its international standing is very different from what it was in 2001. And I'm going to say something about that in my very last remark in a moment. But it exists now as a country that is in relative decline, striking relative decline. And I also think that narrative is we're back to where we started. It bothers me because it absolves policymakers of the interim decisions that they made in those 20 years. There were critical junctures where events could have unfolded differently. Does that mean we would have a thriving Afghan democracy on a Western model today? Maybe not. But let's think about what those critical junctures were. Let us not let policymakers absolve themselves of responsibility by just saying it was inevitably going to come back to where we started. And the last narrative, Andrew, if you'll permit me, we are now, and this is the one I think we're hearing now from Western countries, well, we're now fulfilling our responsibility through other means, through the resettlement of Afghans who are leaving their country. And in part, that's true. We have a humanitarian responsibility and a very large one. But we should never forget, and it's very similar, I think, in some ways to the situation in this respect of Syria. When Canada patted itself on the back years ago when it took Syrian refugees, it had some, of course, some claim to that praise, but it was a drop in the bucket in terms of who we were able to help. And so let's remember that that responsibility is not just to those who we resettle, but we have a broader humanitarian responsibility. And I think, and this is my last point, that the way in which that gets carried out now is going to look very different. In the Security Council meeting on Monday, where a resolution was passed, the hopes of the French president that there would be a safe haven, a safe corridor for humanitarian assistance was quickly dashed because the diplomacy in the UN Security Council is extremely different from what it was in 2001. Both China and Russia watered down that resolution significantly and is limiting the degree to which Western countries can shape what the international community does now from a humanitarian perspective. And I'm just going to end with a quote from the rising superpower, China, during that debate. This is what the Chinese ambassador said at that discussion on Monday. He said, "We hope that the relevant countries will realize the fact that withdrawal is not the end of responsibility, but the beginning of reflection and correction. And of course, the Chinese are going to be playing a big role as we go forward in whatever the UN does, but also potentially in what happens in Afghanistan. So my closing plea is, let's really rethink the soundbite narratives that people are going to want to take from this, and make sure we ask the kind of tough questions that our panelists encouraged us to ask today. Thank you, Andrew.
I can see Ben, Grant, and Zahra all kind of going, okay, we got to get started, got to respond to this. So it looks like we have our next event already set up, which is springboarding from Jennifer's last remarks. I'd like to keep going, but I think we should probably stop here. Zahra, Grant, and Ben, thank you so much. I hope this is actually the beginning of a conversation. I hope, just as I think we would lament the dropping off of Afghanistan from the front pages of the newspapers. That is, if it's because of a lack of interest, not a lack of tragedy to cover. But I hope we'll keep our attention focused on what's coming. And I hope you will all maybe come back either through Zoom or maybe in person to Max Bell at some point down the line. I'd like to have you all. Zahra, Ben, Grant, Ben, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone listening in, and we'll see you all in one way or another sooner than later. Thank you.